his dedication in heralding forth that life-changing, life-giving message. Help us all to learn tonight how we might serve thee better, how we might rejoice even more because of thy grace, how we might look forward every day to a better day because of that hope that we have in Christ. And in his name we pray. Amen.
Our invitation song tonight will be 744. 744 will be the invitation song tonight. When I first moved to the area in 1991, I was privileged to work with the South Haven congregation, and Brother Elkins had been their preacher just before my coming. Before him, Brother Mosher and Brother Hires. And I really wondered how I ever got the privilege of working there after such great men had worked there before. It didn't take me long to figure out the profound influence that Keith and Dorothy Mosher had had upon that congregation. I came to find out that wherever they've been, they've had such an impact and have touched people's lives both by their care and compassion and the knowledge. Brother Mosher would tell you that he's married to the number one preacher's wife, Dorothy, and I don't want to debate him about it tonight, so we're going to say that she's definitely right up there, and she's right up near the top. And we do appreciate Brother and Sister Mosher both for their work's sake. Brother Mosher is a tireless worker. For years he has been. He's an educator, he's a writer, he's been a missionary, a gospel meeting preacher, he's been whatever he's needed to be to bless the Lord's work and the Lord's church. A 1975 graduate of the Memphis School of Preaching, and certainly went on to get higher degrees beyond that as far as academic degrees are concerned, but he teaches his classes with a deliberate scholarship that I believe is one that, as I travel, I'll ask the students from time to time, former students, who are some of your favorite classes or teachers and memories and et cetera. And I can promise you that when you've been somewhere 39 years, like Brother Mosher's been here, he's going to be mentioned, but he's mentioned by just about every generation of students we've had. And we love him. This work he's done for this lectureship has been tremendous, as well as the others that he's directed. And so it's a real thrill to be able to introduce him to you now, to hear him preach on the message, "If by earthly friends forsaken," our brother Keith Mosher.
I'll wait. Put it back to the first one, please. Brother MacNaught taught us that if there was a turtle on a fence post, you know it didn't get there by itself. Thank you, brethren. The song says, "When by earthly friends forsaken still, more closely to him cling." It is generally very difficult to pay homage to God when at the same time people you have loved and respected have let you down. Paul said on one occasion, "Demas, a very wonderful friend, hath forsaken me." Demas was afraid to die for the cause. He loved this present world, and he forsook one of his best friends, the Apostle Paul. 2 Timothy 4:10. On one occasion, when Paul wrote to the brethren at Thessalonica, he said, I can stand, I can live, I can exist if you stand fast in the Lord. 1 Thessalonians 3:8. The apostle said, the only way I can stand is if you remain faithful. So to Paul, when the brethren became unfaithful, in a sense they had forsaken him. Not only the Lord, but him. It's a common experience for the child of God, for you and me to feel abandoned, to be unable to worship God in an acceptable fashion. Why? Somebody is on our mind. Somebody is bothering us. Somebody has forsaken us. Somebody has abandoned us. Somebody has gone, and we've been able not to worship God anymore because of these terrible, terrible, terrible feelings. You remember that the Lord said there's a time not to come to worship. Did you know that? He said, when you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother hath aught against thee, first leave your gift there and go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. I can't worship God when I'm at odds with my brother. I can't even get my prayers answered when I'm at odds with my wife. 1 Peter 3:7. I've got to somehow understand this feeling of being forsaken and what to do about it. And you remember that the song said, still more closely to him cling. I want us to keep that thought in mind tonight as we think about being forsaken by earthly friends, because when that happens, there are four feelings we have. We feel lost, we feel lonely, we feel deserted, and we feel terribly alone. God's people have always known about being forsaken. Listen to David. When my mother and my father forsake me, what did you say, David? Not if they forsake me, but when they do. The Lord will lift me up, Psalm 27:10. I want to come back to Psalm 27 in a little while. But a later psalmist wrote, who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Evildoers are against me. I feel abandoned. I feel alone. I feel lonely. I feel forsaken. Zephaniah bewailed the fate of the ancient Philistines themselves, not his people. Why? They were forsaken by God. Think about that, preacher. He felt that these evildoers were in bad shape because in his mind they were forsaken by God. What a compassionate spirit Zephaniah had for the Philistines who had been forsaken by God. Zephaniah 2:4. And Isaiah, on one time, bemoaning the state of an apostate nation, Judah, said, they are like a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit. I tell the students all the time, look at the attitude of Isaiah toward these nations who had forsaken God, and especially his own, Judah. I think that God gave us a great message for all of us to contemplate when he told us about Job. Job's friends forsook him, sitting right in his presence, but they weren't really there. You ever felt like that? You're in a crowd, but you feel all alone, different, deserted, abandoned. Bildad said to Job, just because you're angry, should God forsake the whole earth and comfort you? Job 18:4. What's wrong with you, Job, sitting right in our presence and feeling forsaken? It's all your fault, Job. If you weren't such a big sinner, these things wouldn't be happening to you. Nehemiah got so angry with his brothers on one occasion. Why? He said, you have forsaken my work. You preachers ever go try to get funds from a congregation and you get upset because they won't help you? They weren't sitting there waiting on me to come there and ask them for help. They're not necessarily under obligation to me to help with their work, but don't you feel like you were abandoned? Were we? Well, at least we know that Nehemiah felt that way. You folks won't help me with my work, Nehemiah 13:11. And one time the psalmist cried out, I am become a stranger to my own brothers and an alien to my mother's children. He explains it twice just so we get the point. My own family has deserted me. I hope that's the one about Joseph. I can't see it. Is it? Back up one. I can only see down there where Joe's sitting. Is that Job? Genesis 37:27, folks. And all of us know this account. Let me make a point here while I'm thinking about it. Some of you talk about the Bible stories. That's all right. But let me tell you what the liberal means by that. He means they're just stories. So I have learned to use the word account. This is a historical account. It's not a story per se, because they don't believe this book was inspired by God and that these aren't even actual people. And so I have avoided that word for many years now because of the places where I studied and some of the things those professors said. These aren't really stories. This actually happened to Joseph. And he was sold into slavery by whom? His own brothers. And after surviving an ordeal there, he found a job with a man named Potiphar. Guess what Potiphar's wife did? And then accused Joseph of doing what he hadn't done, and she now has him put into prison. She said, that young Hebrew tried to take me. Genesis 39:12-15. And when Potiphar arrived home and his wife told him this account, Joseph's in prison. Now he's forsaken by his brothers, his boss's wife. Any of you folks have trouble at work? And then he's in prison, and the warden puts him in charge of the prisoners, and he meets a baker and a butler, and they have dreams, and Joseph explains the dreams to them. And the butler is restored to his former place just as he dreamed. The butler is hanged. I said that backwards. No, I didn't. The butler was restored to his former place. The baker was hanged. And that butler was asked by Joseph, remember me when you get out of prison? I want you to tell the Pharaoh about me. You know what that butler did? He forsook Joseph. You ever had somebody promise you something and not keep that promise? How many of you young people had your parents promise you something and they didn't come through with it? You know how children feel when that happens? Forsaken, deserted, lonely. Dorothy and I were reared in the most dysfunctional families you can think about. My own father on 2 occasions tried to kill me, one time with a gun. You can't grow up that way and not know what abandonment is, desertion. But then I met a father who said he loved me. Oh, what a difference. I don't know if I could explain to you tonight what it means to have a family as big as this room is. That's special to me. That's very special. And when my own family lets me down, I'm right back there in that house where I was reared. That little boy's forsaken again and abandoned, and he starts feeling like Joseph must have felt. When Judah faced Babylonian exile, this apostate evil nation cried out, "The Lord hath forsaken me." No, Judah, you walked away from God. Don't put those two things together and think it's all right to forsake God and then cry out, "I'm forsaken." Judah tried it. God said, "For a small moment have I forsaken thee." This isn't going to last, Judah, just not very long, just 70 years. Just a small moment. But you're going to have to face the consequences of your sin, and so I'm not talking about this tonight. But when Jeremiah thought about that Judean captivity, that evil nation, he still said, "For these things I weep, mine eyes runneth down with water." He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand it. Because the comforter that should relieve my soul is far from me. I want all of us to open our Old Testaments tonight to one passage. If you don't have it with you, I'll tell you what it says. This is Jeremiah 15:18. Brother Winkler last night talked about being in the grip, the white-knuckle grip of grief. What a great description of that pain. Do you know it? And Jeremiah, turned against by his own family, turned against by his hometown of Anathoth, turned against by his nation, turned to God and said, "You lied to me. You've become to me as a liar, God, and you deceived me." Now that is a feeling of being forsaken. That's abandonment. That's desertion. That's grief. And God said, "Jeremiah, come here. I'll fix it." Jeremiah 15:19. And I've often wondered why it was that God didn't rebuke him for that. Because that was God's child, and God knew him, and God cared for him, and God knew his grief, and knew what he was feeling, and God said, "Come here, child. And I'll fix it. I'll send you back. You keep preaching. Don't you quit." Jeremiah described that being forsaken as a perpetual pain. And Jeremiah, "I'll just put a fenced wall around you, and you'll be all right." There are a multitude of biblical examples. I can't see what that one is. Is that about God's dear Son? Let's go to the cross a moment. Because this example is the finest of all, about being forsaken. And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." Then he translates it for us, Matthew does, from the Aramaic, my God, listen to him, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Oh my Lord, you've identified with my human side. He quoted for us Psalm 22:1 and said, "Keith, you may feel like that one day, because that's how I feel right now. Why hast thou forsaken me?" At his greatest moment of human despair, at his greatest moment of human loneliness, he made my cry and yours and his. Why? God hadn't forsaken him. God watched the whole thing. Isaiah said, Isaiah 53:11, God shall see of the travail of his soul. That's why he sent him. And I don't understand all the time why certain things happen to me. Well, Lord, I'm doing your will. I've been working at this school for 30. I've been trying to teach. And I traveled down a lonely road, and no one said to me. I've been there. And I felt like that. And I don't like the feeling. And neither did the Lord. It's interesting that just a few minutes later he said, Father, you knew he was still there. Into thy hands I commend my spirit. When by earthly friends forsaken, still more closely to him cling. Mental anguish is an internal struggle. I want to read something to you from an article entitled, In the Desert of Feeling Forsaken by God. This is Rasmussen, and he wrote, we may not have loved ones dying around us like Job had. Our finances stripped away, plagued with boils from head to foot. Friends wanting us to confess sins we never committed. A spouse telling us to curse God and die. But that does not mean our mental anguish is any less than Job's was. Mental anguish can never be measured by external events that can be seen with the natural eye. It can only be measured internally, and only God has the ability to measure internal mental anguish. The theology and psychology of feeling abandoned were dealt with in this article by Rasmussen. And the problem that Rasmussen is describing is that intellectually I know that God will never leave me nor forsake me. I know that intellectually, but my emotions become so painful that like the Lord I say, why hast thou forsaken me? Perhaps like Job, you've cried out, my family has failed me and my familiar friends have forgotten me. Job 19:14. Job became so depressed in mind at that moment, he was beginning to believe that God somehow had smitten him. He had come to such a depressed state of mind that everywhere he looked, he couldn't find a friend. He couldn't find anyone who understood. In fact, he said, my brothers have dealt deceitfully as a brook, and as the streams of brooks they pass away. They're like water that just runs by me. They don't help me at all. Nothing that came Job's way had any help for him. Where am I on it? I cannot see that thing up there. I hate that. I'm not where I want to be here. I need one that says, it is important to note. Back one. Could you come up here and... No, never mind. I very seldom get people to come forward. I was just trying. We're going to click it in just a moment, brother. I think that I want to say something right here that's very important. And this is not easily accepted. And when I do grief seminars, people question me about this. I think as Christians we feel that, well, if I'm a Christian, I should never feel forsaken or abandoned. After all, I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me. And He never leaves me nor forsake me. And so if I have these feelings, I must not be very faithful. And when a loved one dies, we shouldn't cry, and we should be joyful and have a celebration. And did you know that death is an enemy? It's not fun, folks, because I'm hurting. I'm glad the other person went to paradise, but what about me? I'm hurting. And I want us to understand tonight that feeling abandoned can actually result in blaming God for the feeling. Listen to Ezekiel 9, 8 and 9. It's right up there on the screen. And it came to pass, while they were slaying them, and I was left, that I fell upon my face, talking about his brethren being killed on the way to captivity. I fell upon my face and cried and said, "Ah, Lord God, wilt thou destroy all the residue of Israel, and in thy pouring out of thy fury upon Israel?" Then said he unto me, "The iniquity of the house," he's blaming God for what was happening to Judah. Then said God to him, "The iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceeding great. The land is full of blood and the city full of perverseness. For they say," watch this, "the Lord hath forsaken the earth." It's his fault that we're going into captivity. And the Lord doesn't see. That's important to understand as we go quickly forward. Next. Dear one, try to take comfort in your pain that the Father did not exempt Jesus from the test of being allowed to feel forsaken. It's key to understand why God didn't cause it, God allowed it. There is a big difference. Why would God allow such a thing? Isn't that cruel and sick, we ask? From our human perspective, most would agree it was cruel. From a heavenly, eternal perspective, cruelty didn't enter the picture. It was setting up a catalyst for Jesus to experience greater joy. You remember, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, suffering the shame. Throughout eternity, than what any of us can possibly comprehend, God never allows suffering in those who keep placing their trust in him to go wasted. Here is the bottom line truth regarding the affliction you are presently experiencing. Your suffering is qualifying you to experience greater joy throughout eternity than what any mere mortal can possibly comprehend this side of heaven. Just don't quit on God. There's some obvious Calvinistic leanings in that thought, but he's right about one thing. I'll never know joy without experiencing the other, grief. Without feeling abandoned and deserted, without knowing the difference. And when I get to the other side and I see what's awaiting, I'll remember that God said to those who were suffering under Roman persecution, "I'll keep thee from the hour of trial, which shall come upon all the world. I'll keep thee from the hour of trial." Revelation 3:10. Next clicker. Let's talk about what happens to us when we feel abandoned. Let's assume that you're a person with a strong sense of duty, and most Christians are. But when you have a strong sense of duty, you imagine that what you are guarding or taking care of or working toward is extremely valuable, or you wouldn't be doing it. And you need that sense of duty, really. But when you have that strong sense of duty, BJ, you live in constant fear of failure. What if I fail? You think about a person guarding a bank who failed one day to stop a robbery. Such a guard who has a large sense of duty will often imagine that he's guilty because he didn't stop it. How many preachers have felt guilty because you didn't make that congregation grow? You didn't get enough students. You didn't get enough money. When you have a strong sense of duty, when the problem comes, you can feel abandoned even in yourself. There's a second problem. When you're a kind of personality that constantly needs to be patted on the back, needs constant support from others who cannot operate without that kind of thing, they are especially prone to despair when abandonment and forsaking comes their ways. And when actual abandonment does occur, they will interpret that action in such a way that those people that did this to me must hate me. How many times have I seen that in counseling couples who have assumed because the other one didn't meet my needs, didn't come my way, didn't do my thing, somehow they have abandoned me. Then there's the type of personality who is truly God's child, but they have the capacity to feel so guilty when they commit a sin that maybe God would forgive them, but they won't forgive themselves. I repented of it, I confessed it, but I imagine I better quit the Lord because who could forgive me? I have forsaken the Lord and He's forsaken me, and so I'll just quit. And especially if somebody else finds out about my sin, with that kind of personality, I'll just quit. But there's another kind of personality that always feels like it never has enough, and it always is alone. Nobody understands me. Everybody hates me. Guess I'll go eat worms. I'm not done what I should, and folks don't love me anyway, and I'm just a poor soul. I remember when Joshua was flat on his face. We lost the battle of Ai. Lord, what are we going to do? Oh, woe is me. And he said, Joshua, get up off of your face and act like a man. Poor soul, poor me. And that person has such a thought of failure in his mind that he's going to fail. As you leave tonight, do not think about an orange. There are failures in life, real ones. There is abandonment, real abandonment by fellow workers, relatives, friends. There are real feelings of being forsaken. People do let one down, another down. Folks do hurt each other, but the question is, what do we do when by earthly friends forsaken? Let's look at the 27th Psalm quickly. Here are the instructions, folks, when by earthly friends forsaken. The thesis of this psalm is that those who desire to worship God, but they cannot because they feel abandoned and hurt, then here are the instructions. He acknowledges, first of all, the most important point of all. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? David knew intellectually, God's there. David knew intellectually, that's my strength. And yet, he continued to have feelings of abandonment. Note verse 2. When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. He said they lost, but I still don't feel right. You know, you would expect an enemy to let you down, would you not? But it's still not a pleasant experience. And David admitted here what every faithful child of God knows, that even when an enemy goes against us, or a brother who becomes our enemy, doesn't it hurt? Surely it does. Look at verse 3. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident. The this in which David had confidence was that whenever he had an attack come, he had a refuge in God Almighty. I don't know if you'll accept what I'm about to say, but my brothers and sisters, when that attack comes, that's the time to express confidence in the Father. He'll get me through this. He will. When David knew that such a time of attack was a time to learn from God, look at verse 11. He learned something. He said, "Teach me thy way." God, I feel awful. I feel abandoned. I feel deserted. Those enemies are coming against my own familiar friend, lifted up his heel against me. But Lord, teach me the way. The way. The Hebrew language says, here's a man wandering around in a desert of loneliness, and he doesn't know how to get to the water or wherever it is he's going. He needs some guidance, and the only way to go is God's way. When the going got tough for David, David knew where to turn. He said, "Teach me thy way." I loved what Brother Winkler said last night. When that trouble comes, stop and look at the Psalms. Listen to what God has to say. Look at verse. Well, don't look at that for a moment. We'll look at verse 10 in a moment. I want us to turn to Philippians 1:28. The apostle told us in a New Testament update of Psalm 27, when you're attacked by an enemy, don't be terrified. They think you've lost. To them, it's a token of your loss, your perdition. But to you, that Islamic terrorist has you on your knees, the knife is behind your head, and you won. Do you believe it? They think you lost. That's about as bad as it can be about being forsaken. But what about your best friend turning against you? There is a hurt well known to so many of God's children. Look at Psalm 41:9. David knew it. His own son, servant, David's servant, who went off with Absalom, turned against David. You fellows are all familiar with this. Mine own familiar friend, and I think that's Ahithophel, hath lifted up his heel against me. In fact, the Apostle John applied that thought to the betrayal of Jesus by whom? Whom? Judas. We know that hurt. Look at this one. This is Psalm 27:10 now. Here's what happened to David. I don't read about this in the prose text, but I see it here. He says, not if, but when my mother and father forsake me. Wow. You know, there's a paradox to that in the New Testament. Did you know that you can't love your mother and father more than you do Jesus? Interesting. But they can forsake you. Here are the instructions quickly. Verse 5. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion, in the secret of his tent shall he hide me. He shall set me up upon a rock. When you're forsaken, number one, that's the time to remember quite clearly, don't quit God. Number 2, verse 9. David said, hide not thy face from me. He's asking God, as Brother Winkler said last night, look at me. My heart said unto thee, thy face, Lord, will I seek. At that moment, David said, I'm looking for you. I know all of this problem has come my way. I've been attacked. I've been abandoned. I've been deserted. But I'm looking at you, God. Please, look at me. Look at verse 6. And now shall mine head be lifted up above mine enemies and about me. Therefore will I offer up his tabernacle sacrifice of joy. Watch this. I will sing, I will sing praises unto the Lord. Keith, your grandson just died. BJ, your mother just died. Bobby, you just had a stroke. Everybody kicking up his heels with joy, are we? Why not? I don't think that's what he means. I think he's saying that even in the middle of all of that, I'm going to wait for God's answer. Look at verse 13. If I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. When you feel abandoned, forsaken, deserted, you need to do something. You need to acknowledge that hurt. Don't keep it in here. Every counseling class I ever had, every psychologist who ever taught us, let us know that when I can get the hurt out here, you folks that are having trouble at home, fussing at each other, you go see a counselor and you get that hurt out here. You bear one another's burdens. You put it out here, it won't be yours anymore. You give it to God, it won't be yours anymore. Too many of us are like the fellow hitchhiking down the road, had a heavy backpack. A fellow in a pickup truck stopped and said, "Get in the back of the truck, I'll take you wherever you're going." The guy got in the truck, the fellow started down the road and looked. The fellow still had the backpack on his back. So he stopped his truck, he said, "Why don't you lay that down in the bed?" And the fellow looked around, he said, "I just didn't think there was room for both of us." That's exactly what we do with our feelings of hurt and despair. We keep them right here. You got to get them out here. So let's acknowledge it. I'm hurting. I'm hurting. And then identify those symptoms that you're having. And in the fourth place, it says on the overhead there, sometimes the trees bend in the wind. I planted a willow tree. I don't know why. I just heard it was pretty. And do you know that thing, when that wind would blow, it would go all over the place. But I went out there one day and I looked at those roots and they had dug as deeper and deeper, and every time the wind blew, they dug deeper and deeper, and I thought, that's what it is. I hurt, I'm abandoned, I'm forsaken, I'll just dig deeper. And finally tonight, look at Hebrews 10 with me. Brother BJ, the only sermon they ever asked me to preach twice at South Haven was from Hebrews 10:32. Call to remembrance the former days. How many of you students have had a test under me? I had a test under me too. I couldn't pass it. Did you pass it? Let me see your hands. Then why are you worried about the next one? How many of you got through the last bit of abandonment and sacrifice and sorrow? How many? You're going to get through it again. That's the way we do it. We call to remembrance the former days. I got through it yesterday, I can get through it today. Bobby, you put up with me yesterday. You can do it one more day. But I love you. God's children have always known what it is to be forsaken. But here's the lesson. Just because I'm a child of God doesn't mean I'm not going to be forsaken, or I'll ever feel hurt or feel depressed. Won't happen. I felt forsaken when Brother Holland called me and said, "I can't come." That's why I'm here tonight. I'm just filling in. That's my job now. I fill in. It hurts to know he couldn't come. I hope you'll send him a card. Otherwise, he's going to feel forsaken. Why do we make the announcements about those who are sick and hurting in the congregations? Just so they won't get angry if we don't make the announcement? Or do you plan to go see them? Take some food, take a card, send a card, say hello? Or don't we care? Do you know how many people have quit the church because somebody didn't pay attention? James, tell me about that. Keith, when you see your brother err from the truth, you go and teach him, and you'll cover a multitude of sins and save a soul from death. Brothers and sisters, don't forsake me. I don't want to be part of a congregation that doesn't care about me. And if I walk out that door, I want you to come and get me. And you elders that go, woo, we can't have church discipline here, you don't know what it is. It's the greatest act of love there is, to go out and get that brother and bring him back. That's what it's all about. Otherwise, you're just forsaking him. And when you yourself feel forsaken, look at Mr. Wilson's song again. When by earthly friends forsaken, still more closely to him cling. How many of you know what a Christian is tonight? That's a fellow who heard the word, believed it, repented of his sins, confessed the name of Christ before witnesses out loud with his mouth, and he was immersed in water. And when he came up out of that watery grave, the Lord said, I've taken away all your past sins. I've added you to the church. I put you into Christ, and now everything's going to be rosy.